My name's Natalie Ridler, and I live in Swansea in Wales in the UK. And I am a mother to an ACC angel, shall we say, because Morgan passed away in June last year. My daughter was born in the April 2021. And prior to that, there was no concerns about Morgan's health. He was absolutely fine and apparently completely healthy. And we had no reason to be concerned about anything at all. After his sister was born in the April, he started some rapid weight gain. Um, it was very quick. It wasn't kind of in line with what he was eating. So I started raising concerns with our health visitor, which is part of the health system here in the UK. Everyone is allocated a health visitor when they have children, so that if they have any issues or any concerns with the child's health or development, they have someone that they can reach out to. And so I reached out to our health visitor, and she was concerned that we were feeding Morgan the wrong diet. She was also concerned because Morgan was still breastfeeding, and I was also breastfeeding my newborn. Her opinion, because it wasn't based in fact, was that my breast milk was too fatty, and that's why Morgan was piling too much weight on. I was offered a healthy eating class to try and cook healthy meals for my children, despite the fact I've got 2 degrees in health, and I know exactly what to feed my children, and neither myself or my husband are overweight. So I'm not really sure what that was based in. So the blame kept being put back on us, really. It wasn't until Morgan started showing symptoms of early puberty. So he was growing pubic hair. And as a 2-year-old, obviously that's not normal. At that point, I went back to the GP for, it must have been about the 6th or 7th time. And they told us that fat children grow excessive body hair, and that would be expected for a child as obese as he was. Um, so at that point, I rang the GP surgery, so our general practitioner, to complain about the care we'd received and how it kept being put back on us. And I asked to see a female doctor who was also a mother. And they gave me an appointment right away, in all fairness. And I had a chat with her, and she agreed to refer us to paediatrics, which is all I was asking for in the first place. But the wait list was about 6 weeks. So we weren't happy to wait any longer because Morgan was still putting weight on. He had a lot of pubic hair, and there was a lot of behavior changes at this point. He was very angry all of the time. He was sleeping a lot of the time, and it was disrupting his schooling and and his interaction with his peers. So we paid to see a doctor privately. And uh, when we went to see him, he had a feel of Morgan's tummy, and he felt his liver was enlarged. His tummy had been felt numerous times by this point, and nothing had ever been mentioned about his liver. So they agreed to send him for a scan, and everything happened really quickly then. He had a scan, an ultrasound of his liver, and we were told at that point by the sonographer that there was a 13 centimetre mass on Morgan's kidney, which later transpired to be his adrenal gland. And we were admitted straight to the National Children's Hospital in Wales, in Cardiff. And that's where we were told that it was likely to be cancer. But it took a couple more weeks before ACC was mentioned, because it had never been seen before in that hospital. It wasn't understood, and they had to seek advice from St. Jude's in Tennessee. So it was a bit of a back and forth process before it was decided that it was ACC in all likelihood. But because they weren't going to biopsy it on recommendations from St. Jude, it wasn't until the tumour was taken out about 8 weeks later that it was then tested and confirmed as ACC. Morgan's surgery took a long time to be organised. It couldn't be done in our hospital in Cardiff. We had to travel to Birmingham, which was 3.5 hours away, because that was where the only oncology surgeon that was happy to operate on it was, due to the size of it, and the fact it was wrapped around the IVC in his stomach. And they felt on the scans it looked like it could have invaded his liver and his kidney. So in all likelihood, he would lose 2/3 of his liver and a kidney. So we travelled up to Birmingham on the 8th of December for his surgery on the 9th of December. And it went ahead, and it took 10 hours. It turned out that it was still in its capsule, and they were happy with that, and they were able to get all of the tumour off of the IVC without damaging the IVC. And it hadn't invaded his liver or his kidney. It was just pressed up very tightly against them. And so they didn't have to remove those. So the surgery, in their eyes, was much more successful than they were expecting. Because before surgery, they gave us likelihood about 5% that he would pull through because of potential huge blood loss and him being so small. So that took 10 hours, and that went well. We were in hospital for about 14 days after that before we were sent back to our home hospital in Cardiff, and they decided that he would need 6 rounds of chemotherapy as an inpatient. So he had 2 rounds of chemotherapy, and when they scanned again, they saw that there were mets in his lungs. So that was then increased to 8 rounds of chemotherapy, and he was listed for surgery at Great Ormond Street in London to remove the mets on his lungs, which happened in the April between rounds 5 and 6. And they got those out fine, and he finished his chemotherapy in July 2022, and his scan after that was NAD. So there was nothing that they could spot. There was about 3 months of clear scans. And in the November 2022, then another tumour had grown in his stomach, which was listed for surgery in January 23 and removed. There was a long gap between the surgery happening and the scan, which is where I think the mistake was. Because in that time he had grown tumours unbeknownst to us elsewhere. And they tried 3 rounds of immunotherapy. And then he went on to, he had 3 rounds of oral chemotherapy on top of his mitotane. But the tumours were still growing, and the mets were still growing in his lungs. He had new ones, they were growing on his liver, and he was transferred into palliative care then. They tried 1 more round of IV chemotherapy to see if it would shrink it at all. But by that point, I think it was just pretty much everywhere, and they decided it wouldn't be conducive to his quality of life to give him more chemo, because it probably wouldn't give him much more time, but he would be very poorly for the time he did have left. So we made the decision to withdraw treatment then. I wish that they'd known more about it, that maybe it wasn't so rare. I wish I'd known. Sorry. I wish I'd known more. And maybe I went down the route of Cushing's. I thought it might be Cushing's, and that was what led me on to ACC, and then you find all the horrible statistics that come with it. And I wish I'd known more earlier, so that he was diagnosed earlier, and that people would listen more, I guess. Because if we'd been listened to maybe at the start, so 5 months before diagnosis, when he started showing symptoms, then maybe the outcome would have been different. I feel very let down, I think, by the people that are supposed to know these things. The oncologists are supposed to know these things. And with all respect to our oncologist, who was brilliant, she recognized that she didn't know what was happening, and she reached out to St Jude's to try and get more information, and they had a protocol, and she followed it to the letter. But I think we got to her too late. And ultimately, I think it was just there was just too much of it in the system. And although we had those NAD scans, it was obviously still sitting there somewhere. And, you know, we didn't really know that much about mitotane. And I think he carried on oral mitotane after his IV chemotherapy, but he had toxicity. His levels reached 34 and he was suffering. And so we decided to stop it. And I think that in hindsight, perhaps, because we did reach out to Dr. Del Riviero towards the end, and I think the mistake was probably stopping mitotane rather than just, we stopped it, and perhaps we should have just had a lowered dose for a little while and carried that on. So I wish people knew more about it, really. The surgeries were particularly hard. The genetic elements, because it was a rare cancer, the genetics team did want to come and test Morgan for Lou-Ferrari and for Beckwith-Weidman syndrome. Morgan was positive for Lou-Ferrari, so we were all tested as a family, and my husband and my daughter are also positive. I was the only one that wasn't, and that was quite difficult because obviously she is predisposed to cancers, and now she has 3 monthly scans, which is brilliant but challenging because we've already been through one childhood cancer journey and would not like to go through another one. I suppose finances, the system might be slightly different in the UK. We were lucky for a little while that we had sick pay with work, but I was on maternity leave when Morgan was diagnosed. So I was able to see out my maternity leave and then go on to sick leave. But towards the end, it became very difficult to manage financially, because our lives were turned so upside down. And obviously you live to your means, you live to your wage, and we struggled a lot towards the end there. And so palliative care is the progression of the disease. It was really quite sudden and very aggressive. Understanding of adrenal crisis and management of hydrocortisone and mitotane in children, particularly. I feel that a lot of the parents I've spoken to of children with ACC are very much treated along the adult guidelines, but with their little bodies and the fact they're growing and running around so much, and they can't understand to rest and to eat as appropriate. I think Morgan needed a much higher dose of hydrocortisone, and we fought for that, and he got it, and his side effects were vastly improved. So I think he suffered a lot with adrenal deficiency symptoms, just because the doctors didn't understand how to dose his steroids appropriately with his mitotane, and also the levels of his mitotane as well. Every single test had to be sent off to France for us, and so they would take his levels and they would go off, and we wouldn't have them back for 2 weeks. And by that point, things probably will have changed at that point. So I wish that there was a faster process for that to be tested, so that Morgan didn't have to wait those 2 weeks and suffer potentially, particularly when he was toxic and he was really, really severe with it. And I guess endocrinology. There seems to be a massive lack of understanding of ACCs and adrenal deficiency and how cancer treatment impacts the insufficiency, because a lot of our issues with Morgan were down to managing his adrenal insufficiency more than it was managing his cancer side effects, because a lot of it was caused by a lack of hydrocortisone. And when we were speaking to the endocrinologist, everything was very much, all right, well, this is what adrenal insufficiency means, and this is what the symptoms are. But they weren't counting in that Morgan was also on chemo on top of that. And I feel like his experience probably could have been better. To trust your instincts and to not be afraid to question medical professionals. They don't know it all. It's okay to go and do your own research, and you shouldn't be shamed for questioning people because they might have a lot more training and knowledge than you, but they don't know your child better than you. And if they would listen, if they'd be better at listening, perhaps perhaps journeys would be a little bit easier. We struggled to keep everyone updated, and it was such a complex journey. And we were inpatient in hospital for a long time. So we started just blogging about Morgan and how he was getting on. And he was also quite funny um, and very entertaining. He was a bit of a class clown and loved a joke. So he was doing lots of funny things that we used to share. And I liked to share the fact that it was all doom and gloom, but not to the children. They weren't sitting there worrying about it. They were running around on scooters on the road and just being generally mad. And so it wasn't all sad children with no hair in beds. It was, there was lots of life on the ward, and that was nice to share. And the hospital that we were in, we had brilliant play therapy teams, and they had a teacher that came around to help. And we had something called the Sparkle Crew, who just came to cheer people up. So they would bring glitter tattoos and music, and the kids would get so excited when they saw them. And obviously, our oncologist, Kathy, who was working so hard to try and get on top of it, we wanted to raise some money for the hospital. And so we started a Facebook fundraiser, and it just went ballistic. And within the space of Morgan's treatment, so from his diagnosis in the October to the point he was all clear in the July, we raised £70,000. They were for other charities. And what we noticed was that Morgan's story had a lot of power, and we built a big platform, and that we were sharing things really openly and honestly. And whilst a lot of people found that challenging, it was actually helpful, because it was going to help parents who were going through that journey to know what to expect. And it helped people who had never been through it or didn't have an understanding of childhood cancer. Because a lot of comments I had in the early days was like, oh, I thought children only got leukemia. And I had to say, well, no, that's just one type. And adults get leukemia too. And people were so invested in Morgan's story and the story of his friends, because we shared lots of stories of his friends, and we made friends, some really good friendships on the ward. So we started noticing the gaps in support. So there's lots of support that's very boxed in, and as long as you tick the box, you get that support. But there's lots of gaps between the support, particularly for parents who are expected to go on long treatment trajectories. Like leukemias for boys is 3 years, and I know some parents that have been fighting childhood cancer for 8, 9, 10 years plus, and the financial support drops way off. And we also noticed that there was a lot of power in peer support, so getting people together so that they could talk about their experiences and share their experiences with people who would understand, that they didn't have to sugarcoat things with, and that understood what all the terms and everything mean. So you didn't have to explain yourself all the time when you're talking about, neutrophils and white cell counts and blood gases and all the rest of it. People just understand. So we registered Morgan's Army, which was just a blog, as a charity in the UK then. And we support families who are treated in the hospital in Cardiff. So they cover all of South Wales. Wales is a small country, we've got about 3 million population. And so the National Children's Hospital is where you have to travel for all oncology treatment. So some people are traveling 3-4 hours just for chemotherapy and then back home, and the costs do mount up. And we understood how it felt and what that meant. So that's what we started fundraising for then. And we've raised £500,000 now. And we support lots of families. We give sibling grants so that siblings, feel appreciated, because sometimes they are the forgotten people. We support equipment grants if there's anything that the children need for physiotherapy or to make their lives easier at home, like air fryers for children on chemo. And we do financial difficulty grants. So if anyone's really struggling with anything, we can help on an individual basis. They just have to tell us what's happening, and we'll help as much as we can. And hopefully we'll be funding some research soon, but that's all in the works. We're kind of working with the local universities to see if there's some work they can do with solid tumours and helping earlier diagnoses.